Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Before I start my talk, I would like to, while my memory's sort of fresh, I would like to send to everybody here at this mosque the greetings of all of those at the Abdullah Quilliam Mosque in Liverpool. We're well aware up there that we're a part of an amazing family of historic mosques in the UK, of which this mosque is also a considerable part. So greetings to everybody from Liverpool. It's interesting to look at that shot that just came up, where we saw the graves of these eminent Muslim converts in the main. My research has been so much with them, in particular Abdullah Quilliam. I'm only a recent visitor to Brookwood Cemetery. I went with Tariq Hussein about last year, and walking amongst those graves, I felt I was walking amongst my own life in a strange way, because I'd done so much work on theirs, and then suddenly there were their graves. But you know the one that's missing? Right in the middle of those somewhere is the grave of Abdullah Quilliam, and still to this day we don't know quite where he is. But we know he's there with them. And perhaps for me, before Almighty God finally takes me to whatever is my final resting place, the finding of Quilliam's grave would be something I would just love to achieve. But there'll be others involved in that story, not just me. I want to take this story back a little bit, because we're constantly sort of pushing its boundaries as historians. And only recently I came across, in fact only 4 days ago, someone showed me this photograph, and I was able to incorporate it into a lecture I gave at Liverpool Hope University, and now with you. So if you look at the picture in front of you, taken in 1829 at the Liverpool Exchange, where you've got these gentlemen standing around in their top hats and tailcoats, and the ladies in their crinolines, and you look very carefully, can anyone see this? Yes. You're looking at a gentleman who is clearly a Turk, clearly an Ottoman, in the city of Liverpool in 1829. Abdullah Quilliam himself was not born until another nearly 20 years after this. So already Muslims were in the city. Who were they? We know that they were from the Turkish Ottoman consulate that existed both in Liverpool and in Manchester. Liverpool, obviously, because of the port, the docks. Manchester, because of the textile merchants that were there from the Levant. So that was at one end of society. At the other end of Muslim society would have been what were called in those days the lascars, or the sailors, who were manning. And I use that word, obviously manning would have been right at that time. They were manning the British merchant fleet. Particularly when the steamships were invented, many of the sailors that drove what was the largest merchant fleet in the world from below decks were Muslims. The Muslims of Somalia, the Muslims of Yemen, and the Muslims of India. Because the British believed that because of the color of the skin of the sailors, of the seamen in the empire, that they could withstand the heat of the furnaces below decks, and that many of them were stokers. And one of the very beautiful letters that Quilliam wrote after he became a Muslim on one of his first trips to Morocco, and he came on board this ship that was going to take him to Morocco as a first-class passenger. And he sends back a message to his small community in Liverpool, and he tells them the story that I came on deck as a first-class passenger, but it came to prayer time. He said, who was I going to find to pray with? A lone Muslim in first class. He said, I walked down, deep down into the ship. He said, until I came to the engine rooms where the fires were burning. He said, and there I found the Muslims. He said, and I introduced myself to them, and they said, lead us in prayer, brother. And Quilliam led this small little prayer group below decks, a first-class Englishman with the sailors down in the furnace room of that ship. And that, to me, tells us so much of the caliber of the man that we're dealing with. The second picture here, also new to me, is the Necropolis. The Necropolis doesn't exist anymore in this form with that wonderful gate, but the Acropolis is actually exactly across the road from the Abdullah Quilliam Mosque, right opposite. It's an old graveyard, one of the first in Liverpool. And when you walk in it, and most people now walk in it with their dogs, you're actually still walking on the graves of thousands of people under the grass. And we know for a fact, and they haven't been moved, some of the graves were moved to other cemeteries. We know that in there is probably the first burial ground of Muslims in this country. Because a ship belonging to the Ottomans, during the time that they were allies of the British in the Crimean War, came into Liverpool docks needing repairs. 13 of the sailors, or soldiers actually, that were on board that ship died from fever. The Turkish consulate organized very quickly that they be buried in the necropolis. When Quilliam started his community right opposite, and he suddenly needed, because he had Muslims both amongst the sailors, the Lascars, and also amongst his own community of converts who were dying, he requested permission to use the graveyard in the necropolis, because he knew that the 13 soldiers of the Ottoman Empire were buried there, and permission was given. So here we're trying now to organize something with the city council and also with the Turkish ambassador in Britain, that we get some kind of acknowledgement of this place. Because if you walk in there now, you would just think it was a place for people to take their dogs for a walk. But I wanted to show you these just to show you just this presence of Muslims in the country goes back and back. If I click in the right direction. We've heard the description already of two remarkable men, and we know from the first one that he had dealings. A slight correction to Christine, it was 1908, not 1911 when Quilliam left. That would have been 3 years before the death of Rashid Stanley. And we know that when Quilliam left at that point in 1908 for Constantinople, he actually requested Rashid Stanley to take over the mosque in Liverpool. And Rashid was 3 years from his death. He said, I'm too old. I wouldn't be able to take that on. A very different history perhaps would have happened for that mosque if he'd have been young enough to take it on. But this is a very different class of person. This is not a working class person. This is someone who is born into one of the most, if you can say, prestigious of Liverpool families. His great uncle had actually been captain of the ship that Nelson died on at Trafalgar. And right to the day of his death, Quilliam proclaimed his allegiance to his British identity by saying that he kept the sword of his great uncle in his study. His family were watchmakers, and they actually at one point, on one of the trips across to Istanbul to visit the Sultan, they sent a gift from the family watchmaking firm, which was valued at 2,500 guineas in that time. So this was a family who were, craftspeople at the highest level, but they were also deeply religious. They were Methodists. And as Methodists, we've heard the temperance movement mentioned already. They were very staunch members of the temperance movement. This is the movement of Protestants in particular to campaign against the use and abuse of alcohol in this country. And Quilliam gave his first talk with his grandfather. His first public appearance was actually as what came to be known in the media of the time as the Temperance Boy. And he spoke with his grandfather and proclaimed at the age of 8 that he was a follower of the temperance movement, and that in his life he himself would never ever touch alcohol at the age of 8. And when he died a Muslim, he actually, one of the things he said at that time was, "I'm very proud to say that vow that I made at 8 was kept throughout my whole life, and became much easier to keep as a Muslim than it ever was as a Christian." But he was also involved. This is a radical man. This is a man who is involved not only in the temperance movement. He was one of Liverpool's greatest trade union leaders. He was president of the Dockside Carters Union. He was also involved in campaigns, letter writing campaigns for what he saw as the freedom of the Negro, he called it, in the United States. So they may have freed them from slavery, but they have not yet made them equal citizens. And he was actually awarded at one time an honorary degree at the first free black university in the USA. This is a campaigner. And we see him following a path throughout his life where he's wanting to resolve his political views with his religious views. And he passes through various different organizations, both politically and religiously. And he finds himself a home amongst the Unitarians as he begins to challenge Christian theology. And he begins to challenge, if you want, the authorship or the story of the Bible, which at that time, the scholarship of the Bible is beginning to develop and question its authorship. So we see him looking, and at some time in the late 1880s, having already, and I like to think myself, that perhaps it was seeing these Ottoman gentlemen walking around the docks that makes him look at Islam. And he decides not to follow the road of atheism in his Christianity, but to follow the road of what he calls a purer monotheism, out of the same Abrahamic root. And it's in this journey, I don't know whether consciously, he goes to Morocco. And in Morocco, he tells a story of 3 people who meet at dinner. One is a Jew, one is a Muslim, one is a Christian. He's the Christian in the 3. And he said, each one of us has to describe what are the best points of our faith. He said, at the end of that conversation, I decided that I couldn't speak defending myself as a Christian anymore, but I felt the Muslim had a better story to tell. So he comes back to the UK, and he comes back and he announces that he's become a Muslim. He could have done that quietly. There were many who did. He wasn't the first Muslim in this country by any means. But he says, no, I'm going to root this religion in my home nation as one of its faiths, and show the people of this country, he said, the English people, the British people of this country, that Islam is not something foreign. Islam is not something ethnic, but Islam is a faith rooted in the same prophets and the same history as Christianity and Judaism, and therefore can be practiced by them without thinking that they've become traitors to their own nation or that they're accepting something which is foreign to them. And this becomes his, if you can say, dare I use it, almost like his jihad. It's what he wants to do more than anything else. He burns with a passion to do that. And we know that during the period between his conversion and 1908, when he leaves for Istanbul, that he converts, certainly in Liverpool, around about 250 families. And he's also involved in converting other Muslims in other parts of Britain. And he's also sending dawah materials to help early converts in Canada and Australia. This is a different view of Quilliam. This is the view of Quilliam as he would have been known as the Sheikh al-Islam of the UK, a title conferred on him from the Ottomans. And the medals you see around his chest are actually some of the highest honours that the Ottoman Empire had to award. These were the OBEs and the MBEs of the Ottoman Empire, given to this man for his activities. Unlike Woking, or unlike this mosque here, you can see this is not a purpose-built mosque. This is Brown Terrace, number 8, and it did go on to number 12. 12 was bombed in the war. Number 11 is recently come up for sale. It was a music shop, and we're desperately trying to raise funds to buy back number 11. Because that was certainly a part of Quilliam's original building. Number 8 is where people think he begins, but actually he doesn't. He begins in a small rented property between the two cathedrals, which I may add weren't there at that time, the two great Liverpool cathedrals. So there was a mosque actually on Mount Vernon before either the Roman Catholic or the Protestant cathedrals were built. Astonishing. A small room of which the landlady finally rebelled against them and said, "I'm not having these people in my house, they preach against the Trinity." And she threw them out. And we know that he rented number 8, and then something happens. During the time that he's in number 8, Quilliam discovers that a play is going to be put on at the Lyceum Theatre in the Strand, London, written by his very close friend, Hall Caine, perhaps that's how he found out, depicting the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And that Muhammad is going to be played by the greatest Victorian actor of that time. Quilliam feels this cannot take place. One, because he's not quite sure what portrayal is going to take place. And 2, he doesn't feel that it's Islamically proper for the Prophet to be depicted by an actor anyway. So he sends a letter written by Rafuddin, who was at that time his imam and president of the newly formed Liverpool Muslim Institute, the first Muslim Islamic organization in this country. They send a letter to the Times. Now, what was provocative in that letter is that a stand that Quilliam makes very often. He says, our queen, our empress, has over 100 million Muslims in her empire. This is actually more than the Ottomans have. If you want to antagonize 100 million Muslims in your empire, this is the way to go about it. They get scared, you know. They don't want 100 million Muslims suddenly protesting. And particularly in India, where, of course, there had only been a rebellion in 1856. So, successfully, and a lot of people don't know this story, it's a wonderful story in itself, successfully they got that play taken down. Something which we all know from Salman Rushdie's affair wasn't quite so successful, but in this case, the battle is won and the play is taken down. This taking down of the play brings Quilliam to the attention of some of the highest Muslim rulers in the world at that time, including the Ottoman ruler. And of course that takes place through the Turkish consulate in Liverpool. So the next thing we know is that the Crown Prince of Afghanistan arrives in Liverpool from his father, the ruler of Afghanistan, with 2,300 guineas for Abdullah Quilliam, as a personal reward for his activities on behalf of Islam. And with that money, Quilliam buys the whole block. And thus, the first mosque in the UK, although not the first purpose-built mosque in the UK. That belongs to Woking. With the buying of the building, he's able to expand his activities, and he expands it into classes, a first Muslim school, and he expands it to an orphanage for Christian children, I may add. They're off the streets of Liverpool. He turns it into classes on the top for working class boys so that they can develop their careers. And he does it through workshops of what were the modern technologies of the time: photography, gas, electricity. It would have been like going to the mosque and learning IT skills today. A little museum, but also the first little mosque space. And as you can see, this is the mosque space. Very much a kind of an Ottoman style space. He brought across, one of the converts was an architect, and he also brought across architects from the Ottoman world, and they created this tiny and existing today small mosque space. He was actually 32 when he finally became a Muslim. And that's how he's depicted by the media in the city. They think he's a very eccentric character indeed, but they're very careful how they treat him. You don't want to mess with this man. Many people don't realize, and even I didn't have time to do the research. It's a research for another younger scholar to do. This was one of the greatest defense barristers of the Victorian era. And he did 10 of the worst murder cases that the Victorians of the Victorian times, as the defense lawyer, I may add. And he also defended the first Irish bombers that bombed mainland England. When asked why he defended them when they were such horrendous criminals, he said, because it rests, he said, democracy does not rest with politicians. So they take it away. He said, democracy rests with the law. And the central plank of British law, that the worst citizen and the most poverty-stricken has the right to a defence, along with the richest person in the land. He said, so I give them the defence. But he also looked after the women of the docks. And he also became the great champion of Muslim sailors everywhere. And there's a very wonderful story of a sailor who's dying in a hospital in Liverpool. Quilliam goes to see him, and he says to the man, what is it you want more than anything else? And the man says, I want a Muslim funeral, and I want my 1 year's salary to be got from the shipping company and sent to my village in India, to my family. And Quilliam says to him, die peacefully. He says, I guarantee you both of those things. And he buried that man himself, conducting a Muslim funeral in the graveyard I showed you. And then he went to the company and he said, I'm Quilliam. You know who I am. You know my reputation as a lawyer. 1 year's salary to that man's family, or I see you in court. He was also a journalist. And as a journalist, you don't mess with that combination. Top journalist, top lawyer, that's not the kind of people you want to get on the wrong side of, you know. So the press treat him quite kindly, but he does run into a number of controversial issues. He's not afraid of anyone. And this is a man who, when the Sudan war broke out and Muslim soldiers fighting for the British in Egypt are being used as a part of the British forces in the Sudan, issues a fatwa in which he declares it's actually inappropriate and even against the law of Islam for Muslims to kill Muslims on behalf of an army of non-Muslims. This got him into huge trouble with the British government and the security forces. It also got him into trouble with Indian Muslims too, because they wrote to him saying, please, we love what you're doing, that you're creating Islam in Britain, but don't involve yourself in politics, keep to religion only. And he wrote back to them in one letter saying, then you have to tell me where religion begins and politics ends, I don't know. He said, I'm telling you not to kill Muslims. He said, that's written in the Quran. If it's written in the Quran, is that religion or politics? He says, you write back and tell me the answer and I'll follow accordingly. He conducted Muslim marriages inside the mosque. This is one. These were highly controversial. Can you imagine in the Victorian era that you marry a Muslim man with a non-Muslim woman, or vice versa? Modern community. In 1988, when I did my master's degree and then my PhD, always on the religious side, so my PhD was on the different religious movements that were helping to form or create the Muslim community in this country. And I never really and I still don't consider myself an historian. But I went up to Liverpool with a new job in 2007. But I'd been approached before that by an amazing gentleman called Akbar Ali, whose own life really needs to be recorded. And when I came to Liverpool, he came to me and he said, Ron, can you put on some lectures, he said, that tell the early history of Muslims in this country? He said, because I've approached John Moores University, I approached Liverpool University, they won't do it. I said, okay, let's do it. So we set up a series of lectures, and I gave the first lecture on Quilliam, and Mohammed Seddon gave the second lecture on the Yemeni community in this country, and then other scholars followed. And then one day Akbar Ali came to me and changed my life. I didn't know at the time he was going to change my life, but he did. He said, Ron, write the biography of Abdullah Quilliam. And I said, I can't do that, I'm not an historian. And he said, come on. He said, no one else is going to do it. I said, I'm surprised somebody else hasn't. And he said, no, do it. And I thought and thought and thought about it. And then I was up with a real historian, the wonderful Humayun Ansari. And I said to Humayun, I can't do this, you should be doing it. And he said, why can't you? I said, I'm not an historian. He said, okay, let's look at it in perspective, Ron. He said, you research something about a living community, Muslim community in this country. How long does it take you to research? I said, 2 or 3 years. He said, then you find a publisher. How long? I said, 6 months, 1 year. He said, then you wait for it to be published. How long? I said, 1 or 2 years. He said, okay. He said, nearly a decade. He said, it comes out and it's published. He said, it's 10 years old. Aren't you an historian? Quilliam took over my life, and I still don't know why this person sort of was chosen by whoever is looking at us here. But I got chosen to be Quilliam's biographer. It's totally transformed my life. I was already working with the Muslim community, but I'm so proud and happy that the enrichment of my life by my contact with Muslims in this country and outside of this country that has come to me through writing this biography has enriched my life beyond anything I can possibly tell you. I love you all. And I hope, that the work isn't finished. I know that now there are young scholars who will take this work up. They will take it forward. But there's still so much work still to be done. And I'm very proud, really, really proud, that 3 years ago the trustees of the Abdullah Quilliam Mosque in Liverpool, Britain's first mosque, asked me to become a trustee. And as a trustee, my responsibility is for the heritage and the museum side. I don't know anything about running a mosque. That's something I do not want to engage with. The other trustees are perfectly competent to do that. But the Quilliam's building and everything that it contains inside of it is a responsibility I carry very close to my heart. And what we're trying to do there is to reproduce that building now, certainly number 8, exactly as it was in 1894. We know exactly how it was because it was reported by a Turkish journalist who stayed with Quilliam for 3 weeks. We know what the pictures were, what the wallpaper was. We even know what quotes of the Quran Quilliam had and where. And that's now my challenge, is to reproduce, with the efforts of everybody who wants to get involved in that project, to have the mosque back to how it looked at that time, so that Muslims from everywhere in this country can come and see where it was that certainly religiously they began. So I'll finish with that particular, because I think that's probably the most appropriate way to finish, by leaving us with the Sheikh al-Islam of the UK at that time, Abdullah Quilliam, in prayer. Thank you.